The moment Belle Hawkins rode into Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1882, she did so with a wanted poster bearing her name folded inside her boot, and a rifle across her saddle that she knew how to use better than most men in the territory. The town of Caldwell sat near the Kansas-Indian Territory border, and it was the kind of place that had seen everything twice over and felt nothing anymore. Cattle drives pushed through in thunderous columns of dust and horns, and saloons kept their doors open from sunup to sundown and beyond. The sheriff was a tired man named Dupree who wore his badge crooked and spent more time at the Lucky Star than behind his desk. Caldwell was not a welcoming place for strangers, and it was especially unforgiving for a woman traveling alone. Belle was 24 years old, with dark chestnut hair she wore pinned under a wide-brimmed hat, and eyes the color of good strong coffee. She was not delicate, and she had never had the luxury of being treated as though she was. She had grown up in Missouri, the daughter of a cattle trader who drank too much and died owing money to the wrong people. That money had become her problem the moment the dirt settled over his grave. The men he owed were the Vance brothers, Dale and Cutter Vance, who ran a loose and violent operation out of the Oklahoma Territory, and who had decided that since the debt could not be paid in cash, it would be paid in other ways. Belle had refused that arrangement with a Winchester rifle and a hard ride north in the middle of the night, and the wanted poster in her boot was the Vance brothers' revenge, a falsified accusation of horse theft filed with a crooked marshal who took their money and asked no questions. She needed a place to disappear for a while. She needed work that would keep her fed and not require her to explain herself too much. She needed, though she would not have admitted it out loud, a little bit of luck. What she found instead was Thomas Ralston. He was standing in front of the Caldwell Cattlemen's Exchange when she first saw him, arguing with a man in a city suit over what she would later learn was a grazing rights dispute that had been festering for 2 years. Thomas Ralston was 30 years old, lean and weathered in the way that men who work land get weathered, not beaten down but refined, like wood grain brought out by hard weather. He had dark blonde hair, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in 3 or 4 days, and an expression of deeply controlled frustration that told Belle he was a man who thought before he acted, which in her experience was rarer than gold in a dry creek bed. She did not pay him much attention. She rode to the livery, arranged stabling for her horse, a big sorrel she called Copper, and then went to find something to eat. The Cattlemen's Hotel had a dining room that served beef stew and cornbread, and Belle sat at a corner table with her back to the wall out of habit and ate with quiet efficiency while she listened to the room. She had learned early that a room would tell you everything you needed to know if you listened to it right. She heard that the cattle season was picking up. She heard that the marshal from Wichita had come through 3 days ago asking questions about a woman matching her description, which made her stomach go cold and tight. She heard that a ranch called the Ralston spread north of town was hiring seasonal help for the drive preparation, which was unusual since most ranchers hired in the spring, not midsummer. She was considering that last piece of information when the door of the dining room opened and Thomas Ralston walked in, still looking like a man who had been arguing with someone in a city suit and hadn't quite let go of it. He sat 2 tables away, ordered coffee and whatever was hot, and then looked up and found her looking at him. Belle looked away first, which she immediately resented. She finished her meal, paid the woman who ran the dining room, and stood to leave. She was at the door when she heard his voice behind her. "You're new in town," he said. It was not a question and it was not an accusation. It was simply an observation made by a man who paid attention to his surroundings, which she recognized in him because she did the same thing herself. She turned around. "That obvious. Caldwell's not big enough to hide much," he said. "I'm Thomas Ralston. I run the spread north of town." "Belle Hawkins," she said, and watched his face for any recognition of the name. There was none, which was a relief. "You looking for work?" he asked. She studied him for a moment. "What kind of work?" "I've got a crew of 8 getting ready to move 600 head north toward the railroad junction at Wichita. One of my hands broke his leg last week falling off a green horse, and I'm short a rider. The work is hard. The pay is $40 for the drive, and it takes 2 weeks if the weather holds. Belle felt the weight of the situation settle around her. 2 weeks riding north would take her away from Caldwell right when the marshal from Wichita might be coming back through. It would put her in the company of 8 men she didn't know, under the authority of a man she had just met. It would mean disclosing at least some of her skills, which would raise questions. "I can ride," she said. "I can rope. I can work cattle." "I can see you can ride," he said. "From the way you came in this afternoon, that's a well-handled horse." She was mildly startled that he had noticed her arrival, and she filed that information away. "When do you leave?" "Day after tomorrow dawn." "I'll be there," she said. She was at the door again when he said, "Miss Hawkins, I run a straightforward operation. I don't ask questions I don't need answers to, and I expect the same courtesy in return." Belle looked at him over her shoulder. Something in the way he said it told her that he had guessed there were questions that could be asked about her, and that he was choosing not to ask them. She did not know whether to be grateful or suspicious, so she was both. "Fair enough," she said, and walked out into the Caldwell evening. The town smelled of horses and dust and frying meat from the saloons, and the sky was going orange and purple over the flat prairie horizon in a way that made the ugliness of the place look almost beautiful. Belle stood on the boardwalk outside the hotel and breathed in the cooling air and told herself this was just a job. 2 weeks. Then she would figure out the next move. She did not allow herself to think about the way Thomas Ralston's eyes had held hers without flinching, steady and measuring, and something else she could not quite name. She was up before first light the next morning, checked on copper at the livery, replaced a loose shoe with the help of a sleepy but capable farrier, bought supplies for the drive from the general store, and spent the remaining hours of daylight studying the land north of town and getting her bearings. She rode out about 4 miles, sat on a low rise, and looked at the wide Kansas prairie spreading out in every direction. The grass was thick and summer gold, and the sky above it was enormous in the way that eastern sky never was, pressing down and out in all directions simultaneously. She was sitting there when she heard hoofbeats and turned to find Thomas Ralston riding up from the south on a big gray horse. He stopped a respectful distance away and looked out at the same view she had been contemplating. "Good place to think," he said. "I was checking the terrain," she said. "Is that what you were doing?" "Yes." He dismounted and let his horse graze, and he sat on the same low rise several feet from her without asking permission and without crowding her, and they both looked at the prairie for a while in silence that was surprisingly comfortable. "Drive goes straight north for about 60 miles, then curves east toward the Chicaskia River," he said, as if they were in the middle of a conversation. "The hard part is the first 2 days crossing the open flat. After that the cattle settle and it gets easier." "Is there water trouble?" "Not this time of year, but I've done this drive in a dry October and I won't do it again." Belle nodded, storing the information. "How many women work cattle drives in this part of Kansas?" "Not many," he said. "My crew won't give you trouble about it, I'll make that clear before we ride." She looked at him sideways. "I can handle trouble." "I know that," he said quietly. "That doesn't mean you should have to." Belle did not have a response for that, so she said nothing, and somehow that silence was its own kind of answer. That evening she stayed at the hotel and lay awake longer than she intended, thinking about the marshal from Wichita and the Vance brothers and the crooked wanted poster in her boot. She thought about Dale Vance, who was 40 and mean in the particular way of men who had never been told no by anyone except the people too powerless to enforce it, and about Cutter Vance, who was worse because he smiled while he worked. She thought about her father's debts and the night she had ridden away from the only home she had known with a rifle in her hands and the absolute certainty that she could not stay. She thought about Thomas Ralston saying, "That doesn't mean you should have to." She told herself to stop thinking about Thomas Ralston. The next morning she rode out to the Ralston spread at 4 o'clock in the dark and found the operation already underway. Fires were burning, horses were being saddled, coffee was being passed around in tin cups, and 600 cattle were making the particular low sound that cattle make when they are aware that something is changing and they are not sure they approve. The spread was a working ranch with a solid stone house, several large barns, and the kind of well-maintained fencing that told Belle the owner was methodical and took pride in his work. Thomas Ralston introduced her to his crew without ceremony or apology. There was Hector Medina, who was 50 and had been driving cattle since before the war and who had a gray braid and an unreadable face. There was a young man named Jimmy Coles, who was 19 and enthusiastic about everything to a degree that Belle found either endearing or exhausting depending on the hour. There were 6 others, all of them seasoned, and all of them regarded Belle with the careful neutrality of men who had been told to behave. Hector Medina assessed her with dark, experienced eyes and said, "You ride left flank or right?" "Left," she said. He nodded as if she had passed a test, and that was that. The drive moved out with the first gray light of dawn, and the sound of 600 cattle moving across the Kansas grass was the kind of sound that got into your chest and vibrated there, deep and powerful and almost musical if you were in the right mood. Belle settled into the rhythm of left flank immediately, reading the cattle the way you read a river, always watching for the moment when the current wanted to change. She was good at this work and she knew it, and the knowledge gave her a clean confidence that had nothing to do with bravado. Mid-morning Thomas rode the line, checking on each rider, and when he reached her left flank position, he fell in beside her for a quarter mile without speaking. A young heifer near the edge of the herd began to drift, and Belle cut Copper sideways before Thomas had even moved, pushing the animal smoothly back into the mass, and when she returned to position, she found Thomas watching her with an expression she could not read. "Good instincts," he said. "Experience," she replied. "Those are usually the same thing," he said, and rode on. The first day covered 14 miles and ended at a creek bend where the grass was deep and the water clean. Belle helped settle the herd into their nighttime routine, and then unsaddled Copper and rubbed him down with a worn cloth she kept in her saddlebag. She was eating beans and salt pork by the fire when Jimmy Coles sat down across from her with the guileless energy of a golden retriever. "Where'd you learn to work cattle like that?" he asked. "Missouri," she said. "You come from ranch country. My father had cattle." She paused. "For a while." Jimmy accepted this with the easy incuriosity of someone whose own story was uncomplicated. He told her about growing up in eastern Kansas, about wanting to save enough money to start his own small spread someday, about a girl in Caldwell named Rosa who worked at the bakery and had the best laugh he had ever heard. Belle listened and asked the right questions and let herself be soothed by the ordinariness of it. Later, when the fire burned lower and most of the crew had turned in, she found herself sitting across from Thomas Ralston, who was drinking coffee and looking at the fire with a thoughtful expression. "You settled in well today," he said without looking up. "It's good work," she said. "Straightforward. Most things on a drive are straightforward. The cattle want to go somewhere else and you convince them otherwise." He paused. "How long have you been riding alone?" She considered the question and its implications. "About 8 months." He looked up then. "Long time to be on your own." "Long enough to know how," she said. He nodded slowly, and she had the strong impression that he understood more than she had said, and that the understanding did not change his estimation of her in any direction she had not earned herself. "Get some sleep, Miss Hawkins. Second day is always the hardest." She lay under the stars on her bedroll and thought that she could not remember the last time she had slept in proximity to a group of people without one ear open for danger. The Vance brothers had long arms, and the falsified charge gave them a legal mechanism they might try to use. But they were in the Oklahoma territory, and she was on the Kansas prairie riding north, and for one night at least she let herself feel the distance. The second day was, as Thomas had promised, the hardest. The flat land gave the cattle too many options and not enough reason to choose the correct ones. Two steers broke from the herd in opposite directions within an hour of each other, and Belle ran down the second one herself, a big roan animal that moved faster than it had any right to, pushing Copper hard through the deep grass until she got ahead of the steer and turned it. When she brought it back into the herd, she was breathing hard and grinning, and she was startled to find the grin happening without her permission. Thomas was watching from the ridge above. When she rode past him, he said, "That was a clean run," with a tone of straightforward admiration that had no theater in it, and Belle felt the words land somewhere in her chest in a way she immediately tried to redirect. By the fourth day, the cattle had settled and the drive had found its rhythm, and the days began to take on a sameness that was almost meditative. Wake, ride, work, eat, sleep. The Kansas sky was enormous above them, and the grass went on forever, and Belle found herself thinking less about the Vance brothers and more about the land itself, about the quality of the light in the late afternoon when it turned everything gold and amber, about the sound Copper made when he was content, about the way the other riders' voices carried to her on the evening breeze while they traded stories she only half listened to. She found herself thinking about Thomas Ralston. He was not a dramatic man. He did not grandstand or posture or raise his voice unnecessarily. He solved problems with quiet efficiency and treated everyone in his crew with a basic respect that Belle recognized as deliberate, the kind of respect that comes from deciding on a principle and sticking to it rather than from good moods. He worked as hard as any of his hands. He noticed everything. And in the evenings, when the fire was burning and the cattle were settled, he had a way of sitting in silence that was not awkward or absent but genuinely present, as if silence was a language he was fluent in. On the fifth evening, when the others had drifted toward sleep, he poured a second cup of coffee and held it out to her without asking, and she took it without thanking him, and they sat together watching the fire burn down in a silence that felt like a whole conversation. "Tell me about your spread," she said finally. He considered. "My father built it. He came to Kansas in '66 after the war, bought the land for almost nothing because nobody wanted flat country with no trees. He said the lack of trees was a feature, not a problem, because you could see trouble coming." Belle thought that was a very good philosophy. "He died 3 years ago," Thomas continued. "Left me the spread and the debt he'd taken on to expand it. I've spent 2 years paying it down." He paused. "This drive finishes paying it off." "That's a good feeling to be heading toward," she said. "It is." He looked at her across the fire. "What are you heading toward, Miss Hawkins?" The directness of the question was not unkind, but it reached into places she kept carefully closed. She looked at the fire. "Away from something, mostly. I'll figure out the heading toward part when I've got more distance." He did not push. He simply nodded and said, "That's honest," and she felt obscurely that the honest answer had been the right one with this particular man. On the 7th day, they reached the Chicaskia River and made camp in the cottonwood trees along the bank, and everyone's mood lifted because the hard, flat driving was done, and the herd was 200 head of good cattle ahead of the losses Thomas had built into his estimates, which meant a better sale price in Wichita. In the evening, Jimmy Coles produced a battered harmonica and played it with more enthusiasm than skill, and Hector Medina, who turned out to have a genuinely beautiful voice, sang several songs in Spanish that Belle did not know but found herself moved by anyway. Some of the other riders danced together in the way that men on long drives sometimes did, unself-consciously and purely for the pleasure of moving to music, and the firelight made the cottonwood leaves above them glow orange and gold. Thomas appeared at Belle's elbow and said, "Do you dance, Miss Hawkins?" She looked at him. He was not asking with any particular expectation, and she appreciated that. "I haven't in a while." "Neither have I," he said, and held out his hand. She took it. They danced to Jimmy's harmonica in the cottonwood grove beside the Kansas River, not close in a proprietary way, but close enough that she could feel the warmth of him and the steadiness of his hand at her back, and it was a simple pleasure so direct it almost hurt. She had not allowed herself many simple pleasures in the past 8 months. She had not allowed herself to stand close to anyone. She had not allowed herself to feel the weight of another person's attention like something to lean into. When the song ended, they stepped back from each other with a naturalness that held no awkwardness, and she found that her heart was beating slightly faster than the exertion of the dance explained. "You dance well," he said. "So do you," she replied. He smiled at that, a real smile, not the carefully managed expression she had seen him use in the day-to-day work of the drive, but something looser and more genuine, and it changed the whole architecture of his face in a way that made Belle look away before she did something she could not take back. The next morning she was at her left flank position before sunrise, and when Thomas rode the line he stopped beside her, and they rode together in the pearl-gray light without speaking for nearly a mile. And it was one of those silences that has so much in it that filling it with words would be a reduction. Then he said, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to know that the asking doesn't change anything about this drive or your place on it." Belle felt the cold slide of apprehension. "Ask it." "There's a story going around about a woman named Belle Hawkins from Missouri, accused of horse theft. The marshal from Wichita has been asking about her in Caldwell. She held her body perfectly still and kept her eyes on the cattle. The sunlight was coming up orange over the flat horizon and the cattle were moving well and everything about the morning was ordinary except for the fact that it was not. "What do you want to know?" she said. "Whether it's true," he said simply. "No," she said. "It's not true. The men who filed the charge were owed money by my father. He died before he could pay them. They decided I was an acceptable substitute. I disagreed." Silence. The cattle moved, the grass bent in the morning wind. "I figured it was something like that," Thomas said. She turned to look at him. And nothing," he said. "I told you I don't ask questions I don't need answers to. I asked because I needed to know whether I was harboring an actual criminal or just a woman with enemies." Belle felt something loosen in her chest, some knot she had been carrying so long she had stopped noticing its weight. "And now that you know." "Now I know you've got trouble on your back that you didn't earn," he said, "and I know you're handling it with more grace than most men would." She looked away again because the alternative was showing him something on her face that she was not ready to show anyone. "I'll be gone after Wichita," she said. "The drive ends and I'll move on. Your name won't be connected to mine." "I wasn't worried about that," he said. "You should be," she said. "The Vance brothers have a long reach and no conscience." "I've dealt with men like that before," he said evenly. "Thomas." She said his first name before she had decided to, and heard herself say it with a clarity that changed something between them, a threshold crossed. "I mean it. You don't need this trouble." He turned in his saddle and looked at her directly, with those steady eyes that did not flinch from difficult truths, and said, "You're probably right that I've got enough trouble already. But if I'm being honest with you, Miss Hawkins, you're the only trouble I'd choose." Belle opened her mouth and closed it again. She had spent 8 months being careful, being watchful, keeping everything close and protected, and now here was a man on a Kansas cattle drive speaking with such unadorned directness that all her carefully constructed distance felt like a paper wall. "That's not a smart thing to say," she managed. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." And he rode on down the line, easy and unhurried, as if he had said something as ordinary as a weather observation, and left her sitting on copper in the orange morning light with her heart doing something completely unauthorized. The drive covered the remaining distance over the following 5 days without major incident. There was a brief scare on the 9th day when a summer thunderstorm came up fast from the southwest, and the cattle spooked. And Belle spent 3 hours in driving rain, holding the left flank against a surge that could have become a stampede if 3 or 4 people had not been precisely where they needed to be at the right moment. She was one of them. When the storm passed and the herd was settled and everyone was accounting for themselves, soaked to the bone and laughing with the particular relief of people who had avoided a disaster, Thomas found her and said, "You held the line," with a simplicity and a warmth that meant more than a speech. Hector Medina told her that evening that in 30 years of cattle drives he had seen experienced men break in conditions like that, and that she had not broken. He said this without ceremony, the way he said everything, but Belle understood it for the extraordinary thing it was. On the 11th day they brought the herd into Wichita. Wichita in 1882 was a city trying to decide what kind of place it wanted to be, caught between its cattle town past and aspirations toward something more settled and civilized. The cattle yards were enormous and efficient, and the buyers from the northern markets moved through them with a brisk authority that was almost comical in contrast to the dusty, wind-burned riders who had just driven 600 animals across 200 miles of open prairie. Thomas sold the herd at a good price, better than he had projected, and came back from the exchange office with the look of a man who has just set down a weight he has been carrying for a very long time. He paid his crew that afternoon, and when he counted out Belle's $40, he held the money for a moment before handing it over. "You earned every cent of it," he said, "and probably more." "A deal's a deal," she said, taking the money. "What will you do now?" he asked. She had been thinking about that. The marshal from Wichita was a problem, but the falsified nature of the charge was a bigger problem because it required confronting the source, and the source was in the Oklahoma Territory, which was a long and dangerous ride for a woman alone. She had been turning the situation over in her mind like a stone, examining all its faces, and she had arrived at an uncomfortable conclusion that doing nothing was not a sustainable strategy. "I need to get the charge cleared," she said. "The only way to do that is to get a legitimate law officer to look into the source. The Vance brothers have other enemies. I'm not the only person they've done this to." "Who else?" She looked at him. "There was a rancher in northern Missouri named Garrett Boone. They did something similar to him, falsified a charge to pressure him into signing over grazing rights. He resisted. I don't know what happened to him." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "There's a federal marshal stationed in Wichita," he said. "A man named Aldridge. He's not crooked. He's actually been trying to build a case against operations that run out of the territory." Belle stared at him. "How do you know that?" "Because the Vance brothers have had their eye on the grazing land north of my spread for 2 years, he said. "And I have spent those 2 years being very aware of every legal tool available to me." She felt a new kind of warmth toward him then, the kind that comes from recognizing a kindred mind, someone who had been fighting the same kind of battle through the same kind of quiet vigilance. "Did they try to file against you?" "They tried to buy me out first. When I refused, they circulated some stories about the title to my land being disputed. Nothing actionable, just enough to make the bank nervous." His jaw tightened slightly, the first genuine anger she had seen in him. "I spent 6 months and more money than I'd like to think about sorting that out. And you think this federal marshal could help me?" "I think it's worth the conversation," he said. They went to see Marshal Aldridge the next morning. He was a thin, precise man in his 40s with a neat mustache and the kind of eyes that had cataloged a great many lies and could spot one quickly. Belle told him everything: her father's death, the debt, the Vance brothers' proposition, her refusal, the falsified charge, the name of the crooked marshal who had filed it, and the name of Garrett Boone as a possible corroborating witness. Aldridge listened without interrupting, asked 3 specific questions at the end, and then said, "The marshal who filed that charge has been on my list for 8 months. I have 3 other affidavits connecting him to the Vance operation. If you're willing to make a sworn statement, Miss Hawkins, you'll be adding to a case that I have every intention of closing before year's end." Belle felt the ground shift beneath her feet in the manner of tectonic relief. "What happens to the warrant?" "If your statement is consistent with the other evidence, which I believe it will be, I can have it suspended within the week and cleared formally when the case goes to federal court." He looked at her over his desk with an expression of professional sympathy. I understand you've been carrying this alone for the better part of a year. I have, she said. You won't have to much longer, he said. She gave the statement. She signed it and left a copy with Aldridge and kept a copy for herself. Standing outside the marshal's office in the Wichita morning with the warm city noise around her and the summer sky overhead, she felt lighter than she had in 8 months, as if something physical had been removed from her back. Thomas was waiting on the boardwalk outside. "Well," he said. She told him, and the expression on his face as she spoke was one of unguarded satisfaction, uncomplicated and genuine, the expression of someone who wanted a good outcome for another person with no stake in the credit. "Good," he said. "That's good, Belle." He had used her given name this time, and it sat in the air between them warmly. She let it sit there. "What now?" she said, because she genuinely did not know. "I have business at the bank," he said. "And then I was thinking about getting a decent meal that isn't beans cooked over a fire. Would you have dinner with me tonight?" Belle looked at him. The sun was bright on the Wichita street, and the city moved around them with its ordinary commerce and noise. And Thomas Ralston was looking at her with that steady attention that she had been trying not to lean into for 11 days. "I would," she said. They had dinner at the best restaurant Wichita offered, which was not Paris but was considerably better than beans cooked over a fire. And they sat across from each other for 2 hours and talked in a way they had not been able to on the drive properly, with space and time and no cattle requiring attention. Thomas talked about his plans for the spread, the expansion he had deferred while paying off the debt, the horses he wanted to breed, the improvements to the stone house. Belle talked about Missouri and her childhood and her father, not the tragic version but the earlier version, the one where he taught her to ride and rope and read a terrain, the version that explained who she was before it explained what she was running from. "You loved him," Thomas said. "I loved who he was before the drinking took the better parts of him," she said. "It's possible to love someone and be clear-eyed about what they cost you." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "My father was a difficult man in different ways," he said. "Stubborn. He had a vision for the land and he pursued it to the exclusion of everything else sometimes. My mother left when I was 12 because she was tired of being secondary to a stretch of Kansas grass. Did you understand it when you were older?" "I understood why she left," he said. "I understood why he stayed. I'm not sure either of them was wrong exactly. They just wanted different things." Belle thought about the stone house on the Kansas prairie, solid and well-maintained, and thought about what kind of man built something that lasted. "You stayed," she said. "I stayed," he agreed. "Land is mine as much as it was his, more maybe because I chose it rather than being born to it." She looked at him across the restaurant table with the lamplight warm between them and felt something that she had been refusing to name for 11 days demand a name with considerable urgency. "Thomas," she said. "Yes." "Back on the drive when you said I was the only trouble you'd choose." She paused, gathering herself. "Did you mean that, or were you being kind?" He looked at her for a long, steady moment. "I never say things I don't mean to be kind," he said. "Kindness that isn't honest is just a pleasant way of lying." Belle pressed her lips together. "You should know something about me. Tell me." "I have not spent my adult life being gentle with myself about what I want," she said, "because wanting things is expensive when you don't have the security to afford the cost. I have been careful and hard and self-sufficient because those were the things I needed to be. I am telling you this because I think you are a man who deserves honesty, and the honest thing is that I have spent the last 2 weeks trying very hard not to notice you." The corner of his mouth turned up. "How'd that work out?" "Not especially well," she said. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, gently, without presumption, just a warmth and a steadiness. "I've been trying not to notice you since the moment you walked into that dining room in Caldwell," he said. "I'm also not very good at it." Belle turned her hand over under his and held it, and the simplicity of the gesture, after 8 months of holding everything alone, was so profound that she had to blink very deliberately and look at the wall for a moment. "I don't know where I'm going," she said. "I don't have a place." "You could come back to Caldwell," he said. You'd be useful to me on the spread, and you know the country now, and I would like very much to continue a conversation that we have only just started." She looked back at him. "As a hand." "As whatever you want to be," he said carefully. "I'm not going to press you toward anything, Belle. I just don't want this to end at the Wichita city limits." She was quiet for a long moment. The restaurant was busy around them, full of the sounds of a prosperous Kansas cattle city, and outside the window the street was lit by oil lamps and the constant movement of a town that had not learned to slow down. "All right," she said. "Caldwell." They rode back south over the following 2 days with the rest of the crew, traveling lighter without the herd. And the pace was easy, and the weather was clear, and the rolling Kansas country was beautiful in the late summer. Belle rode beside Thomas for long stretches without either of them needing to manufacture conversation, and the ease of it surprised her. She was not a person who found ease easily. She had been tense for so long that ease felt like a kind of permission she had not granted herself. On the second evening, camped again on the prairie with the stars enormous above them, she and Thomas sat apart from the others in the way that had become natural over the last weeks, and she leaned against him with a casualness that was also a decision, her shoulder against his arm, and he adjusted to accommodate her without remark. And they sat like that for a long time watching the fire and saying not very much. "There's a room in town at the Caldwell Hotel," he said. "Mrs. Garrett, who runs it, is a reasonable woman. You'd be welcome there until you find your footing." "I'll pay my own way," Belle said. "I never doubted that," he said. She tipped her head against his shoulder briefly and then straightened. "I'm not a woman who makes things easy," she said. "I'm not looking for easy," he said. "I had a ranch to run at 17 years old. Easy is not a condition I'm particularly familiar with." "I'm serious, Thomas. I'm difficult and I'm private and I have opinions about most things and I express them whether people want to hear them or not. And I have spent most of my life making decisions by myself, and I'm not sure I know how to do it differently." He turned to look at her, and in the firelight his expression was so undefended and direct that it made her breath catch. "Belle," he said, "you've got enough trouble without a woman like me. I heard you say something like that to yourself out loud on the 4th day of the drive when you thought no one was listening." She stared at him. She had no memory of speaking aloud, but she had been thinking it. "I heard you," he said, "and I want you to hear me when I say that you are precisely the trouble I want, not in spite of who you are, because of it." Belle looked at him for a long, searching moment. She looked for the performance in it, the angle, the thing that men said to get what they wanted from women who were tired of being alone. She did not find any of that. She found a man who had watched her work for 2 weeks without flinching, who had learned something about her situation and used it to help her rather than to leverage her, who danced in cottonwood groves and had the patience of stone and the warmth of the fire he was sitting beside. "You are going to make this very complicated," she told him. "Probably," he agreed. "I am not a woman who does things halfway," she said. "I would be disappointed if you were." She kissed him then, because the alternative was continuing to resist something that was already a fact, and because the night was warm and the stars were out and they were somewhere north of Caldwell on the Kansas prairie, and there was no good reason not to. He kissed her back with the same quality he brought to everything, fully present, unhurried, with a warmth and a certainty that she felt all the way to her boots. When they separated, she pressed her forehead against his briefly and then sat straight and looked at the fire. "Complicated," she said again, but she was not unhappy about it. They rode into Caldwell on a Wednesday morning at the end of August, and Caldwell received them the way it received everything, without ceremony. Belle checked into the hotel, washed the trail dust off, and slept for 12 hours straight. When she woke, she felt different in a way she could not immediately describe, as if the particular kind of alertness she had been maintaining without a break for 8 months had finally been given permission to ease. She went to work at the Ralston spread 3 days later. Thomas had been straightforward about the arrangement from the beginning. She was a hired hand with particular skills. She would be paid a fair wage. She would make her own decisions about the work as she always had, and whatever was happening between them personally would develop in its own time without either of them forcing it or pulling back from it. She appreciated the clarity. She operated well within clarity. The work on the spread was different from a drive, more varied, and in many ways more interesting. There were horses to be trained, fences to be assessed and repaired, and the late summer work of preparing the land for the slower seasons ahead. Belle had always found working land satisfying in a way that working for pay in a town never was, a connection to something larger and more enduring than any single season's trouble. She and Thomas worked side by side most days, and the easy rhythm they had found on the drive translated naturally to the spread. Hector Medina stayed on as the ranch's permanent foreman, and his quiet authority organized the work with an efficiency that left everyone knowing what they were supposed to be doing. Jimmy Coles came and went with the enthusiastic unpredictability of a young man who had not yet decided what his life was going to look like, and every time he left for Caldwell, he came back with updates about the girl named Rosa at the bakery that everyone pretended not to find entertaining. In September, Marshal Aldridge sent a letter to Caldwell. Belle read it in the hotel dining room with Thomas sitting across from her and Jimmy, who had no idea that reading private correspondence over someone's shoulder was impolite, also present. The Vance brothers had been indicted on federal charges including extortion, fraud, and the filing of false legal instruments against no fewer than 7 parties in 3 states. The crooked marshal who had filed the warrant against Belle was suspended pending investigation. The charge against Belle Hawkins of horse theft was formally suspended and would be expunged from the territory records upon the completion of the federal proceeding, which Aldridge expected to conclude by January. Belle read the letter twice. She folded it carefully and put it in her shirt pocket. "Well," Thomas said, though she suspected he had been reading it upside down across the table. "It's done," she said. "Or near enough done." Jimmy, who had gathered enough of the situation to understand its significance, said, "That's good, Miss Hawkins. That's real good," with such genuine feeling that Belle found herself briefly and unexpectedly moved. That evening, Thomas came to find her at the spread's western paddock, where she was working with a young bay horse that had been difficult all week, patient and repetitive, asking the horse the same question in different ways until they found a shared language. The sun was going down gold and red over the flat Kansas horizon, and the air had the first breath of fall in it, that particular clean sharpness that follows August heat. He leaned against the fence and watched her work for a while without speaking. She was aware of his presence the way she was always aware of his presence, with a warmth and a calm that she had stopped fighting. When she finished with the horse and came to the fence, he said, "I've been thinking about something." "Tell me," she said, matching the directness he had always offered her. "The charge is being cleared," he said. "You've got your footing under you now. You could go anywhere you wanted from here. Colorado, California, back to Missouri if you wanted to reclaim something there." She looked at him steadily. "Is that what you think I should do?" "No," he said. "I think you should stay. I'm asking you to stay, not as a hand or not only as a hand." He paused, and for the first time she saw something that might have been uncertainty in him, the careful man briefly without his careful armor. "I'm asking you to stay as the woman I want to build something with, if that's something you could want." Belle was quiet for a long moment. The bay horse moved behind her, and the evening smelled of grass and horses and the coming fall, and the man standing at the fence had steady eyes and honest hands and had not asked a single thing of her that she was not willing to give. "You know what I am," she said, "difficult and private and full of opinions." "I know," he said. "I'm asking anyway. And the spread, the stone house, that's the life you're offering." "That's the life I'm offering," he said. "Work in hard seasons and good ones, and a partner who I think is as suited to this land as anyone I've ever met." She considered him. She considered the spread, the stone house, the enormous Kansas sky. She considered Hector Medina's steady competence and Jimmy Coles's hopeless romanticism and copper in the barn, and the way the land looked in the early morning when the light came up gold across the flat grass. She considered the feeling of his hand over hers at the dinner table in Wichita. "All right," she said. He smiled, and it was that real smile again, the one that changed the whole architecture of his face. "All right," he agreed. They were married in November, in a ceremony held at the Caldwell church that was small and direct and suited them both. Hector Medina stood up for Thomas with the solemn dignity of a man taking the honor seriously. Jimmy Coles, who had by this time summoned enough courage to begin courting Rosa from the bakery in earnest, brought her to the wedding and spent the whole of it alternating between joy on behalf of his employer and a nervous private contemplation of his own future. Mrs. Garrett from the hotel provided a wedding supper in her dining room afterward. The minister who married them was a plain-spoken man who kept the ceremony brief and the sentiment genuine. And when he said the words that made them husband and wife, Thomas looked at Belle with the same clear, unhurried attention he brought to every important thing, and she looked back at him without hiding anything. After the ceremony, they rode out to the spread together in the cold November dusk and went inside the stone house, which Belle had helped prepare over the previous weeks with the same practical efficiency she brought to everything. And Thomas lit the fires, and she made coffee, and they sat in the kitchen of their house with the wind outside and the warm light inside and talked until very late about everything, and nothing and all of it mattered. Winter on the Kansas prairie was its own education. Belle had grown up with Missouri winters, which were cold but green in a particular way that Kansas was not. Kansas in January was a flat white expanse under a sky the color of iron, and the wind came without obstacle from every direction simultaneously. The cattle required constant attention, the horses required more, and the daily work of keeping a spread running through a hard winter was demanding in ways that a cattle drive, with its clear finite purpose, was not. Belle found that she was good at winter the way she was good at most things, not by natural ease but by intelligence and effort. She learned the rhythms of the land through the cold months, the way she had learned them through the warm ones, by watching and listening and thinking hard about what she saw. Thomas was a patient teacher who did not condescend, and she was an exacting student who did not pretend to know things she did not know. And together, they got through that first winter on the spread with only the ordinary losses and crises of a working ranch. In February, when the worst of the cold was past but the snow still lay on the ground, Belle rode out one morning to the low rise north of the spread where she could see the whole of the land spread out around her, and she sat on copper in the gray winter light and looked at it all. She had not known, 8 months ago on the road north from Missouri, what kind of future she was riding toward. She had known only what she was riding away from, the debts and the threats and the narrowing options of a woman alone in a world that regarded women alone as either a problem or an opportunity. She had ridden hard and kept her own counsel and built nothing because building things required staying still, and staying still had not been safe. She sat on the rise in the February cold and looked at Thomas Ralston's spread, her spread, the land they worked together, and felt the extraordinary solidity of it under her. Copper shifted beneath her, impatient with the cold, and she turned him and rode back. She was 3 months pregnant, though she had not yet told Thomas. She told him that evening in the kitchen after supper as directly as she did everything. He sat very still for a moment. Then he said, "You're sure?" "I'm sure." He stood and came to her and held her face in both hands and looked at her with an expression of such undefended joy that she felt the reality of it in every part of her. He kissed her forehead, then her temple, then her cheek, and then held her against him in the kitchen warmth, his arms solid around her. "We're going to need more room in this house," he said, and she laughed, actually laughed, which she had been doing more often since November and which still surprised her when it happened. Spring came to Kansas in a rush of color and warmth, and the spread came alive with the particular energy of a working ranch in the season of new beginnings. The horses were foaling, the cattle were calving, and every morning brought something new requiring immediate practical attention. Belle continued to work with a modification to her activities as her pregnancy advanced, not stepping back from the work, but adapting it in ways that were sensible rather than limiting. In April, they received word that the federal case against the Vance brothers had concluded. Dale and Cutter Vance had been convicted on multiple counts and sentenced to federal prison. The crooked marshal who had served their interests was stripped of his office and faced his own charges. The falsified warrant against Belle Hawkins was officially and permanently expunged from all territory records. Belle read the final letter from Marshal Aldridge, standing in the yard of the Ralston spread in the April sunshine with copper grazing behind the fence and the smell of new grass everywhere. She folded the letter, held it for a moment, and then put it in her pocket. Thomas came out of the barn with straw on his jacket and looked at her face. "Good news. It's done," she said. "All of it. It's completely done." He crossed the yard to her, and she handed him the letter and watched him read it. When he looked up, his expression was one of complete, uncomplicated satisfaction, the satisfaction of a man who had watched someone he loved be given back something that should never have been taken from her. "Done," he agreed. She stepped into him and he put his arms around her, and she stood in the spring morning with her face against his neck and breathed, which was something she had been doing more of lately, just breathing, just being in the fact of safety and time. Hector Medina walked past them toward the water trough with the businesslike air of a man who had noticed them but was too professional to acknowledge it. Jimmy Coles, arriving from town on his horse with a wide grin and a paper-wrapped package that was almost certainly something from the bakery, had no such professionalism. "Good morning, Mr. Ralston, Mrs. Ralston," he said with a brightness that was practically luminescent. "Morning, Jimmy," Thomas said. "Beautiful day," Jimmy offered. "It is," Belle said, and meant it completely. Thomas spent the spring making the additions to the stone house that a growing family required, and Belle spent it with him when she wasn't needed in the field, working alongside him with the easy competence that had always characterized her approach to practical problems. She had not imagined herself particularly suited to the specifics of domestic building work, but she discovered she was wrong about that, which pleased her in the way that discovering any new capacity pleased her. Hector Medina's wife, a compact and formidable woman named Esperanza who had joined him at the spread from their previous ranch in late winter, became a close companion to Belle in a way Belle had not expected, and that she valued more than she would have predicted. Esperanza had strong opinions, a great deal of experience with exactly the kind of life Belle was now living, and absolutely no patience for pretense of any kind, which Belle found deeply restful. In late July of 1883, their son was born. He arrived in the stone house on a hot prairie night with Esperanza and the doctor from Caldwell present, and Thomas paced the kitchen through the hours of labor with the controlled composure of a man keeping himself very deliberately together. And when the sound of a new baby's first declaration reached him through the bedroom door, he sat down in his kitchen chair and pressed his hands over his face for a moment in the unguarded way of a man overcome by something for which composure is insufficient. Belle held her son in the warm July night and looked at him with an expression that Thomas described later as the most complete thing he had ever seen on another person's face. They named him Samuel James Ralston, James for Thomas's father because the debt and the difficulty of the man did not erase the love, and Samuel for no particular reason, except that it suited him. Hector Medina held Samuel 3 days after the birth with the careful hands of a man who had held many children and knew their particular weight and gravity, and looked at him for a long moment and said, "Good." Jimmy Coles, who had been pacing outside the main house since the birth, was allowed in to see Samuel on the 4th day, and said with absolute sincerity, "He's the best-looking baby I've ever seen," which was not necessarily true but was certainly felt. Autumn came with its particular golden light and Thomas's first complete autumn as a debt-free landowner, and a father was one of those seasons that he would hold as a measure for the rest of his life against which other things were compared. The spread was running well. The horses he had been breeding were developing into something he was genuinely proud of. Belle had recovered her full strength and resumed her place in the work of the ranch with Samuel strapped to her back, in a carrier that Esperanza had shown her how to make, which scandalized the more conventional of the Caldwell townswomen and delighted Belle enormously. She and Thomas rode the land together in the evening sometimes when the light was long and the air was cooling, and Samuel, now 4 months old, regarded the Kansas prairie from his position on his mother's back with the serious concentration of someone compiling information. "He's got your eyes," Thomas said one evening on the low rise north of the spread where Belle had gone alone on the February morning. "He's got your stubbornness," she replied. "That seems unlikely given the competition," Thomas said, and she pushed his arm and he caught her hand and held it, and they sat on their horses on the rise in the autumn evening looking at their land spread out below them, and the stone house and the barns and the horses moving in the paddock and the wide Kansas sky going pink and orange above it all. "Belle," Thomas said, "are you happy?" She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved, because she had never been a woman who said things she did not mean. She thought about the wanted poster that had been in her boot, which she had burned in the kitchen fire after Aldridge's final letter. She thought about 8 months of hard riding and watching and being careful, and she thought about a cattle drive and a cottonwood grove and a man who danced badly but cheerfully and a dinner in Wichita and a morning on a low rise in February looking at land that had become hers. "Yes," she said, "I am." He squeezed her hand. Samuel made a sound from his carrier that could have been agreement or could have been a comment on the temperature. "Good," Thomas said. "Me too." The following years layered themselves onto the spread with the accumulating richness of a life that was growing rather than merely continuing. The horse breeding operation became something that attracted buyers from as far as Colorado, and Thomas spent 3 weeks in the spring of 1885 working out a contract with a buyer from Denver that would set the financial direction of the spread for years to come. Belle handled the ranch's accounts and correspondence with a precision and intelligence that Thomas had suspected she would when he first hired her, and their partnership in the practical management of the spread was as efficient and satisfying as their partnership in everything else. Samuel Ralston grew into a boy who combined his mother's alertness and his father's patience in proportions that were different from either of them and entirely his own. By the time he was 2, he was following his parents through the routines of the spread, with a concentrated observation that Hector Medina declared would make him either a very good rancher or a very dangerous lawyer. Jimmy Coles married Rosa from the bakery in the spring of 1884, a ceremony to which the entire Caldwell community turned out with considerable enthusiasm, and Thomas and Belle stood up for them respectively, and spent the reception dancing and watching Jimmy's face go from nervous to joyful in the space of the ceremony, and then to something deeper and quieter as the evening went on. "That's what it looks like from the outside," Thomas said quietly, watching Jimmy and Rosa dance. "What does?" Belle said. "Happy," he said simply. She took his hand and they went out and danced themselves, in the barn of the Coles family farm east of Caldwell, with better music than Jimmy's harmonica this time, but the same Kansas summer sky overhead. Esperanza Medina became the closest friend of Belle's life in the way that friendships between strong women sometimes happen, built on mutual respect and honest disagreement, and the particular intimacy of shared hard work. They disagreed about nearly everything in the way of 2 women with developed opinions and the confidence to express them, and they found this entirely enjoyable. Hector Medina told Thomas that the 2 of them argued more than any 2 people he had ever known and were better friends than any 2 people he had ever seen, and Thomas said that sounded about right. In the summer of 1885, Belle told Thomas she was pregnant again while they were mending the south fence in the July heat. He looked at her over the fence post. "You're sure? Do you always ask me that?" she said. "Apparently," he said and grinned. This time the pregnancy was different in texture from the first, not harder but different, and Belle approached it with the same practical intelligence she brought to everything, while maintaining the full work of the ranch with adaptations she designed herself. Esperanza, who had borne 3 children, was a resource both practical and philosophical, and their kitchen table conversations over this period were some of the best Belle had. In February of 1886, on a cold Kansas morning not unlike the February morning Belle had sat on the rise looking at the land 3 years earlier, their daughter was born. They named her Clara, and she arrived in the world with an opinion about it that was expressed immediately and at volume, and Thomas held her in the kitchen afterward, while Belle slept and looked at his daughter's furious small face with an expression of complete wonder. Samuel Ralston, 2.5 years old, was allowed to meet his sister the following morning, and regarded her with the serious assessment of someone who was not sure yet whether this development was good or bad and was withholding judgment. By the afternoon he had decided it was good, largely on the basis of Clara's grip on his finger, which he reported to Thomas with some surprise. The stone house, which had been expanded once already, was expanded again that spring to accommodate the fuller life it contained, and Thomas did the work with the help of Hector and 2 other hands while Belle managed the daily operation of the spread with Samuel on her hip and Clara in the cradle near the kitchen fire. And the activity and noise and complexity of it all was nothing like the silence of the road 8 months alone. Nothing like the careful containment of a woman who had learned not to want too much. It was messy and loud and demanding and entirely real, and Belle loved it with a fullness she had not known she had capacity for. The summer of 1886 was one of the best the spread had. The horse contract with Denver expanded, the cattle herd was healthy and well managed, and the land itself, the flat, beautiful Kansas prairie that Thomas's father had bought because of the trees it didn't have, was producing the kind of returns that made the years of debt and caution feel like the foundation they had actually been. In August, Thomas and Belle rode out together in the evening in the way they had made a habit of, the 2 of them on the land they had built together, and the children were with Esperanza at the house, and the light was long and gold, and the grass was thick and summer-warm. They stopped on the rise north of the spread, the rise that had become a kind of private place for both of them. 4 years ago this month, Thomas said. Belle looked at him. 4 years ago this month you hired me off a street corner in Caldwell. I hired you out of a dining room, he said. There is a distinction. You were very straightforward about it, she said. I am a straightforward man. You are, she agreed. She looked out at the land. I rode into Caldwell with a warrant in my boot and nowhere in particular to go, she said. I was not planning to stay. I know, he said. I am very glad I stayed, she said. Thomas Ralston looked at his wife in the August evening, in the particular light that made the whole prairie golden, and she looked back at him with the clear, steady gaze that had been the first thing he had noticed about her, the gaze of a woman who looked at the truth of things without flinching, and the years between the dining room in Caldwell and this rise in the evening light were all present in the way they looked at each other. So am I, he said. She took his hand and they stayed on the rise until the light went completely and the stars came out in their enormous Kansas abundance, and the air was warm and the land was quiet, and somewhere below them, their children were in the stone house that was both his father's and their own, and the warrant was burned and the Vance brothers were in federal prison, and the spread was paid for and thriving, and this was, Belle thought, what the heading toward part looked like when you finally arrived at it. There had been a time when she had believed that a woman like her, with the trouble she carried and the history she had and the hardness that had been necessary for so long, was not the kind of woman a good man wanted beside him on a long road. She had said it to herself on the 4th day of a cattle drive on the Kansas prairie, not quite out loud, and a man who paid attention had heard it. She was the only trouble he wanted, he had said, and she had fought it, and then she had stopped fighting it, And here they were on the rise in the August dark with their lives built around them and the stars pressing down and the quiet real certainty of a love that had been earned honestly and held without pretense. "We should go back," she said. "In a minute," he said. They stayed a minute longer, and then another, because the evening was that kind of evening, and there was no particular urgency in going home when home was the direction everything had been going all along. When they finally rode down from the rise and into the yard of the Ralston spread, the stone house was lit warm from inside, and they could hear Esperanza's voice and Samuel's high, clear laughter, and Clara had stopped declaring her opinion about the world long enough to be quiet, which was itself a kind of miracle, and Thomas unsaddled the horses while Belle went inside. And when he came in the kitchen door a few minutes later, she handed him coffee without looking up from the pot, because they had arrived at the easy fluency of a life lived together, the language of small, ordinary gestures that mean everything. He sat at the kitchen table with his coffee and watched her move around the kitchen with the competence and the confidence that had always defined her, and the children were somewhere in the house with Esperanza, and the spread was settled around them for the night, and Thomas Ralston looked at his life and found it entire. Samuel appeared in the kitchen doorway with the elaborate casualness of a child checking, to confirm that his parents were where he expected them to be, assessed the situation, and went back to wherever he had been with the satisfied air of someone whose intelligence has been confirmed. Belle sat down across from Thomas with her own coffee, and they looked at each other across the kitchen table of the stone house in the way of two people who have seen each other clearly from the beginning and have not been disappointed. "The Hendersons to the east are selling," Thomas said. "South pasture adjoins ours." "Is it good land?" she said. "Good land, good water," she considered. "Can we afford it?" "If the Denver contract renews in the spring," he said. "Yes." She nodded slowly, turning it over in the methodical way she turned over all problems of consequence. "Then we make the offer," she said. "That's what I think," he said. "Then we're agreed," she said. He smiled at that, the full, unguarded smile, and she returned it with the equal fullness of a woman who had learned that the things you allowed yourself to feel were not less safe for being felt out loud. Outside the kitchen window, the Kansas night was enormous and dark and bright with stars, and the land stretched away in all directions to the flat horizon, and the grass moved in the night wind the way it had moved when Thomas's father first bought this country because of the trees it didn't have, and you could see trouble coming from a long way off. But tonight, there was no trouble coming. Tonight there was only the stone house and the warm light and the quiet spread and the children's voices, and the coffee going cold between them, and the steady particular happiness of two people who had found each other in a dusty Kansas town in 1882 and had not let go since. Belle reached across the table and Thomas took her hand, and the story of how she had ridden into Caldwell with a warrant in her boot and nowhere to go continued in the way that the best stories do, forward together, into the long and ordinary and extraordinary years ahead.